The air in the room didn't just cool, it curdled. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift, the heavy, ionized atmosphere before a supercell tears through the plains. Pete Hegseth, a man whose persona was forged in the kiln of military discipline and sharpened by the relentless glare of the television lens, stood at the precipice of a sentence that would reconfigure his reality. Across from him sat Kid Rock, the Detroit renegade, a man who had spent decades cultivating a coat of armor made of grit and defiance. But as the words left Hegseth's lips, that armor didn't just crack, it vanished. The camera, a cold and silent witness, captured the micro-gestures of a man losing his footing, the widening of the eyes, the slight parting of the lips, the sudden, heavy stillness of a body usually in constant motion. This wasn't a mere political pivot or a career transition. This was an announcement that hummed with the frequency of destiny, a revelation so profound it left an icon of American rebellion utterly, hauntingly speechless. The morning sun over the Potomac is often filtered through a haze of humidity and history, casting long, uncertain shadows across the marble icons of power. For Pete Hegseth, those shadows had always felt like a second skin. He sat in the dim light of his study, the silence of the house amplified by the ghosts of his own past. He traced the edge of a framed photograph from his time in Iraq, the dust, the heat, the visceral smell of cordite and adrenaline. He felt the phantom weight of the plate carrier on his chest, a pressure that never truly left him, even in the plush studios of New York City. The narrator observes the tightening of his jaw, a reflexive response to the internal conflict raging beneath the surface, the duty to the past versus the calling of an uncharted future. He was a man defined by service, yet haunted by the feeling that his greatest battle had not yet been joined. The scene shifts to a quiet, dimly lit hallway. The sound of his own footsteps echoed, a rhythmic ticking of a clock he couldn't stop. He thought of the men he had led, the lives lost in the name of a flag, and the growing realization that the battlefield had shifted from the sands of the Middle East to the soul of the nation. The guilt of surviving, of thriving in a world of talking points while others remained buried in foreign soil, gnawed at his periphery. He wasn't just a commentator. He was a soldier looking for a mission that justified his survival. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact name that represented a different kind of fire. As he prepared to meet the one man who embodied the raw, unpolished spirit of the country, Hegseth felt a cold shiver of resolve. He knew that what he was about to disclose would end one life and begin another. He stepped out into the blinding glare of the afternoon, the transition from shadow to light almost violent in its intensity. He was walking toward a bridge, and he had every intention of burning it behind him. As the door to the private lounge opened, Hegseth saw the silhouette of Kid Rock framed against a window, unaware that the next 10 minutes would shatter his perception of the man standing before him. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and old leather, a sanctuary of shared values and unspoken understandings. Kid Rock leaned back, the embodiment of a restless energy currently held in check by a glass of ice. He looked at Hegseth, the polished veteran, the face of the movement, and saw a kindred spirit, a man who had navigated the trenches of media with the same defiance he had brought to the stage. But as the conversation drifted from the mundane to the monumental, the air began to thin. The narrator notes the way the light caught the amber liquid in Rock's glass, a shimmering distraction from the gravity settling into Hegseth's eyes. Pete didn't lead with small talk. He led with a silence that demanded attention, a void that Rock instinctively tried to fill with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm stepping away," Hegseth said, the words falling like stones into a still lake. The grin on Rock's face didn't disappear, it froze. He watched the veteran, looking for the punchline, the wink, the sign that this was a strategic play for a better contract or a new show. But there was only the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who had seen the end of his own era. Hegseth spoke of a calling that transcended the screen, a move into a sphere of power so direct and so volatile that it felt like a suicide mission to the uninitiated. He detailed the private conversations, the offers made in the dark, and the decision to trade the safety of the studio for the crosshairs of the ultimate arena. The silence that followed was visceral. The ticking of a nearby mantel clock became a hammer blow. Rock lowered his glass, the ice clinking with a sudden, jarring sharpness. He had spent his life shocking the world, but he was being blindsided by a man he thought was predictable. He saw in Hegseth not just a friend, but a mirror, a reflection of the ultimate sacrifice for a cause. The psychological weight of the moment pressed down on both men. For Hegseth, it was the relief of the truth. For Rock, it was the realization that the stakes had just been raised beyond anything he had imagined. Rock leaned forward, his voice a low rasp that barely broke the silence. "You realize if you do this, Pete, there's no coming back. They'll try to bury you before you even take the oath." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the magnitude of Hegseth's announcement settled into the woodwork. Kid Rock stared at him, his mind racing through the implications. To the world, Pete Hegseth was a voice. To the establishment, he was a nuisance. But with this move, this sudden, seismic shift into the direct machinery of the state, he was becoming a target. The narrator delves into Rock's internal landscape, a mixture of profound respect and genuine fear for a man he considered a brother in arms. He thought of his own battles with the machine, the scars he carried from decades of being the outsider. He saw the path Hegseth was choosing, and it was paved with the bones of those who tried to change the system from within. Hegseth didn't flinch. He described the why, the moments of quiet desperation watching the country he loved drift into a fog of apathy and bureaucracy. He spoke of his children, of the legacy of the uniform, and the terrifying realization that his voice was no longer enough. He needed his hands on the wheel. The sensory details of the room sharpened. The smell of the cedar walls, the distant hum of traffic, the way the shadows danced across Hegseth's face, masking half of it in darkness. It was a visual metaphor for the man himself, part public servant, part shadow warrior. Rock finally spoke, his voice devoid of its usual bravado. He asked about the cost, the family, the reputation, the relentless shredding of one's soul that comes with high-level power. Hegseth leaned in, his eyes burning with a cold, clear light. He wasn't looking for approval. He was seeking a witness. He explained that the decision wasn't made in a boardroom, but on his knees, in the quiet hours of the night when the only sound was the beating of his own heart. The psychological tension reached a breaking point as Rock realized this wasn't a choice for Hegseth. It was an inevitability. Just as Rock opened his mouth to respond, Hegseth's phone buzzed on the table, a secure line, a name flashing on the screen that made even the rock star's blood run cold. The phone continued to vibrate, a mechanical heartbeat on the polished wood. Hegseth didn't pick it up. He let it ring, the sound a bridge between the private room and the chaotic world waiting to devour him. Kid Rock watched the phone, then looked back at Hegseth. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the presence of the powerful figures waiting on the other end of that line. The narrator explores the profound isolation of the moment. Hegseth was caught between the life he had built and the destiny he was claiming, a man standing on a tightrope over an abyss of public scrutiny and political warfare. Rock stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. He saw the lights of the Capitol in the distance, a glowing hive of ambition and betrayal. He thought about the purity of music versus the filth of politics. "They'll wait for you to stumble," Rock said, his back to the room. "They'll take everything you've ever said, every mistake you've ever made, and they'll turn it into a noose." He turned back, his face etched with a rare, raw sincerity. He wasn't the performer now. He was a friend looking at a man stepping into a firing squad. Hegseth joined him at the window. The two men stood side by side, the soldier and the singer, two symbols of an American archetype that the coastal elites could never quite decode. Pete spoke of the fear, acknowledging it not as a weakness, but as a compass. If the move didn't terrify him, it wasn't big enough. He detailed the strategy, the allies he had secured, and the internal iron he had forged to withstand the coming storm. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to shift again, moving from shock to a grim, militant acceptance. The announcement was no longer a secret. It was a declaration of war. Rock reached out, his hand gripping Hegseth's shoulder with a strength that spoke of a blood oath. "If you're going into the pit," he whispered, "you'd better make sure you're the most dangerous thing in there." The aftermath of the revelation left a lingering static in the air. The transition from the shock of the announcement to the reality of its execution began to take shape in the way Hegseth moved. more deliberate, more tactical. He began to pack his things, not just physical items, but the mental remnants of his previous life. The narrator captures the internal shedding of his skin. The Fox and Friends persona was dissolving, replaced by the grim resolve of a man re-enlisting in a different kind of war. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing the soldier return to his eyes, the soft edges of celebrity hardening into the sharp lines of a commander. Kid Rock watched him, a quiet observer of a transformation. He realized he wasn't just witnessing a career change. He was witnessing a rebirth. The psychological depth of the scene is found in the unspoken bond between the two, a shared understanding that some men are built for the storm and others are built to be the storm. Rock thought of his own journey, the moments where he had to reinvent himself to survive, but this was different. This was a sacrifice of a comfortable life for a chaotic calling. The sensory details of the room, the fading light, the cooling embers in the fireplace, signaled the end of an era. They walked toward the door together. The hallway felt longer than before, the path to the exit representing the threshold of a new reality. Hegseth felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that only comes after a definitive choice is made. The weight he had carried in the opening chapter hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer a burden of guilt, but a weight of purpose. He was no longer looking back at the ghosts of Iraq. He was looking forward to the battles of the future. The transition was complete. As they reached the outer door, Hegseth turned to Rock and said, "The world finds out tomorrow. Are you ready for the fallout?" The finality of the moment hung in the air as the two men stepped out into the crisp night air. The city was a sprawling map of light and shadow, unaware that by morning, its headlines would be dominated by one name. The narrator reflects on the nature of legacy, how it is not built in the moments of ease, but in the moments of radical, uncomfortable courage. Pete Hegseth stood by his vehicle, the engine idling like a predator in the dark. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that room hours earlier. The shock he had delivered to Kid Rock had acted as a catalyst, solidifying his own resolve through the lens of another man's disbelief. Kid Rock leaned against the brick wall, lighting a cigar, the ember glowing like a small, defiant sun in the darkness. He watched Hegseth, a man he now saw as a pioneer of a new, dangerous frontier. The psychological arc of the documentary concludes with a sense of tragic inevitability. The hero must leave the safety of the tribe to face the monster alone. Rock blew a cloud of smoke into the night, his eyes following the tail lights of Hegseth's car as it pulled away. He knew that the Pete Hegseth the public knew was gone, replaced by something far more formidable. The camera lingers on the empty space where the car had been, then pans up to the Washington Monument, a stark white needle piercing the black sky. The outro is a slow-burn montage of Hegseth's life, the young soldier, the father, the commentator, and finally, the man standing in the shadows of power, ready to strike. The music swells, a low, cinematic cello underscored by a rhythmic, industrial beat. The announcement wasn't just a career move, it was a soul-level realignment. As the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice remains, a heavy, reflective whisper. Some men are born to follow the path. Others are born to tear it up and build something new from the wreckage. Tonight, a bridge was burned. Tomorrow, the fire begins. The silence that follows is the true ending, the quiet before the explosion of a new American chapter, defined by a man who dared to stun the world, starting with the one person who thought he'd seen it all.